So here's our book, the cover of our book, The Wizard and the Prophet, two remarkable scientists and their dueling visions to shape tomorrow's world. And I like this book, because of the actual wizard versus prophet themes, which I think are really valuable for how to think about solutions to environmental problems in this century. But I also just like it because it gets you to think on larger scales. So it gets you to think on larger time scales and larger spatial scales. So I think, we're used to thinking about our lives on pretty small time and spatial scales. Like time wise, you kind of think about what you're going to do today, maybe this week, you're kind of thinking about this semester. Maybe you're thinking about like, okay, my major will help me in this career. Like that's kind of the time horizon that we're used to thinking on. And then spatially, you kind of think about your house and your neighborhood and maybe San Jose State. And I guess increasingly we think a lot about like the nation, especially with national politics, but we don't usually think about the whole world. And so this book really does make you think about those things. So one theme that's talked about in the prologue is human population, and that's one of these things that like you really have to step back and think on a little bit longer time scales to get a grasp for how important this is, or how big of a change we're really talking about compared to what it was over the past and really the recent past in terms of the geologic age of the Earth. So this is a graph of world population, so number of people on the planet over the past 12,000 years. So this goes back to 10,000 BCE, before Common Era, 8,000, 6,000, 4,000, 2,000, 0. And so you can see, there's only 4 million people on Earth 10,000 years ago. And it was basically flat. We had this growth rate of 0.04% per year, so growing, but just very, very slowly. And then year zero, we're still only at 190 million people. And then, we're at 1,500, we're starting to tick up. 1,700, we're at 6 million. 18, so it takes another 100 years to get another about 400 million. And then we're up to 1.65 billion, 2 billion. Then we're starting to add, billions really rapidly, right? 2 billion, 3 billion, 4 billion, 5 billion, 6 billion, 7 billion. So this last one is just, we added a billion in a little over a decade. So this is like a real, hockey stick graph. We see a lot of hockey stick graphs that look like hockey sticks in this class. And so it just, gives you an idea of, okay, humans are going to be impacting the planet just orders of magnitude more now than they were just recently in the recent past. So just, you're talking about like 500 years ago or something like that. It's just not even comparable, really. And so we're really in kind of new territory when it comes to that. They mention in the book, now this kind of looks like, okay, when is this going to end? Does this just go to infinity? And then surely then you just run into absolute boundaries where you have to, basically you have a collapse situation. And we'll talk more about this with the first chapter, because the first chapter of the book is kind of like that. But he mentions in the prologue that human population is expected to level off. So that's just something I'll make a note of here. So this is, now it's the same graph, but now zooming into the year 1700 and looking at population. And so flat up to 1950s, then going up. But then you can see this kind of inflection point. So starting in around 1970, you actually gradually are starting to see this curve bend and start to flatten off. And so demographers are projecting and expecting human population to not continue to exponentially increase, but to level off and start flattening out. And I think in the book he says 10 billion by 2050. So this is a slightly different projection. So, of course, there's a range of different projections from different demographers. But so this is showing like leveling off closer to 11 billion by 2100. So either way, though, if you go back to this graph, that's still, like way off this chart. And so the point remains that even, leveling off, it's still just this explosive amount of people on the planet that the planet's never, experienced before. So we can think about the human impact on the planet in time another way, and that's through not just the number of people, but through how much we are consuming. So this is gross domestic product per capita, so goods and services consumed or produced per person. And so, that incorporates services like haircuts and things like that. And so that's not necessarily a resource draw on the planet, although it can be because of the energy requirements to run your hair salon, for example. But the goods, are a resource draw on the planet. So anything that's an object that's created has to be mined and refined somehow and put into a different configuration and then shipped and sold. And so those all have, especially if you're not recycling it, then that's going to have some impact where you're taking something from the ground and then you're using it and then you're throwing it away, and then that can have some impact wherever you're throwing it away. Or it could have some impact on where you're mining it from, that type of thing. So this measure of just gross domestic product, goods and services consumed and produced, is also kind of a proxy for human impact on the environment. And so we see, again, that it's not just that people are increasing, it's not just the number of people on the planet, it's that those people are each, because again, this is now per capita, are each tending to consume and produce more products. And so in the United States, we're near the top. This doesn't show every country, but it's just a sampling. But so we're one of the wealthiest countries on Earth, one of the most affluent countries on Earth. So we produce and consume some of the most products. But basically everywhere has shown an increase, especially recently. And so that's just going to kind of exacerbate the changes that we're seeing in population. And by the way, it's interesting to note here that, it's not a coincidence that right around the Industrial Revolution, that's when things explode. The Industrial Revolution, when we found this reservoir of hydrocarbons in the ground that we call fossil fuels that have stored energy from the sun from hundreds of millions of years ago, when we found that and decided that we could run a bunch of machines with this stored energy, that caused this explosion in wealth that allowed human population to explode. So these are all kind of connected together. And, that's, again, it's one of the driving forces behind the increase in production and consumption. So that makes it kind of stark, the human influence over time. But then also looking over space, this is just kind of an image that I think exemplifies that. So this is a image of Earth stitched together from satellite images of just looking at the Earth from space without clouds. So obviously it's never dark on the whole Earth at the same time, and it's never cloudless on the whole Earth at the same time. But if you put together a bunch of images where it is night and cloudless, then this is what you get. And so we can see, humanity has a very large footprint on the Earth. So We're not in the oceans, but over land, we are, over most of it. So it's dark kind of over Canada and Siberia. So we don't like these very cold places. The Tibetan Plateau, we don't really like the Saharan Desert. We are not really in the Amazon rainforest as much. But most of the rest of the planet, Central Australia, also a desert. But most of the rest of the planet, we have quite a presence. And this nightlight example kind of understates it in some cases too. So I'll just show you. This is a similar map, except it's plotting population density. And so if we go back here, we can see like Europe is really bright, and the United States, especially Eastern United States, is really bright. Less bright is Sub-Saharan Africa here, less bright is India. But if you look at a graph of where the actual people are, like India just really stands out, and China as well. So, I mean, a large portion of humanity is in this portion of the globe here. But then Sub-Saharan Africa, so Nigeria, has so many people, and it's not so bright yet. But if we go back to this graph, here's India, Nigeria down here. They're kind of at the beginning of their growth hockey sticks for affluence or for GDP. And so we would expect these to get a lot brighter. And, I'm using lights as like a proxy for wealth here, but it's true that, there's something like 1.2 billion people with no electricity at all right now. And something like 3 billion with, they kind of are considered in energy poverty, where they have limited access to electricity. And so we want, of course, these people to have electricity and to have energy. But then that just does exacerbate the consumption and production trends here. And so we would expect this map with the more people and more affluence to get brighter and brighter and brighter this century. And then one more map I'll show you is just global croplands. So this is, again, just kind of, the idea is just humans' impact on the planet. And so we can see, this is from the year 2000, but it looks similar today. And it's just showing where we use land for crops to feed ourselves. And so there's large portions of the land surface that we use to feed ourselves. So these darkest colors are 75 to 100% of that given grid cell is cropland. And so, I mean, I always am just struck by India, that it really seems like it's kind of the center of climate change this century for so many reasons, because it's it's near the equator, so it's near kind of the hottest part of the world. So the hotter you are, kind of the more sensitive you're going to be to an increase in temperature, because it's further away from human comfort levels. There's so many people there that there's such high leverage on, policies in terms of if they try to develop with coal versus, renewable energy, that affects global CO2 emissions so much. And then there's so much agriculture there too. So that's like a major impact on world food production. So I'm sure Professor Rampini could have more to say about India, but I think it's just a really interesting kind of epicenter of everything that we talk about in this class. Okay, so going back to the actual book, these were just the questions that you answered. So just kind of making sure that we're all on the same page here. I think it's just, there's some interesting, important themes here that, okay, population is increasing, but it's leveling off, but that's kind of the main background, setting here, is that humans have this major impact on the planet that has never been seen before. that a lot of good has come with development in the recent centuries and recent decades. So there's far less people undernourished today than there used to be. Global lifespan has been increasing. But because of these trends, that's where you get these kind of this conflict of visions going forward of the wizard versus the prophet. So our wizard is Norman Borlaug, and that's someone that essentially looks at environmental problems that could be here now or coming about down the road, and says we can innovate to solve them. And then the prophet is William Vogt, and that's someone that is essentially looking at these long-term trends and is saying, this is unsustainable, this is a huge problem, and humanity like fundamentally needs to change course. And so that's kind of the main takeaways from this prologue, and that's what I'm trying to get at with these questions. So I'm not going to go over each one of the questions. You can see once I release the quiz, you'll see any ones that you get wrong. But for right now, I just want to talk about some potential current symbols of wizards and prophets in the current kind of dialogue. So one, I think, good example would be Greta Thunberg. So she was mentioned previously. She's been a very high-profile climate action advocate, named Person of the Year by Time Magazine. This is a quote from her when she gave a speech at the United Nations. She says, "You have stolen my dreams and my childhood with your empty words, and yet I'm one of the lucky ones. People are suffering, people are dying, entire ecosystems are collapsing. We are in the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you?" So what do we think this is in terms of more wizard-like or prophet-like? Yeah, so in the chat, I'm getting tons of prophets. Yeah, so exactly. Like a prophet-like sentiment is kind of, it's looking at all of humanity and saying we need to change course, and we can't talk about, fairy tales of economic growth. So if she was a wizard, maybe she would go to the United Nations and say, hey, everyone, there is a very easy solution to climate change, and it's change to nuclear energy. So we need to switch all our systems to nuclear energy, and here's how we do it. It's more like this technical fix. It's not like a kind of scolding of human behavior type of thing. So kind of another, I just threw on here degrowth. So degrowth is a movement that you'll hear about if you kind of are in these circles, the environmental circles, or if you are kind of Googling around for solutions to climate change. And this is just another thing that's another idea that's very prophet-like. And so degrowth is essentially saying that we need to completely rethink this idea that it's, good for GDP to increase, and we need to have less growth or negative growth in GDP and value other things other than goods and services. And that could be a whole class, very interesting discussion. But I don't think we'll go into that too much in this class unless the other professors do. But it's just something to keep in mind, keep on your radar screen. So maybe the other example that came to mind was more timely last semester, as Andrew Yang, who ran for president in the Democratic primary. So he had some kind of more unconventional solutions to climate change in his policy proposals, and one of them was space mirrors. So he had on his official website, this idea that you could have space mirrors that would essentially be reflective objects up above the Earth. And like we talked about last time in our energy budget diagram, you can cool the Earth by reflecting more energy back to space. But this would be very, wizard-like, right? It's not saying that we need to fundamentally change humanity or our behavior or things like that. We have this fix, and then everything can continue to kind of be the way that it is, and we don't need to necessarily interrogate, our values and things like that. So that's more wizard-like. But even most of the kind of mainstream policy proposals that you see today tend to be, in my opinion, more wizard-like. So this is an example of a policy proposal that recently came out. This is from UC Berkeley, and it's called the 2035 report, and basically it's just about how we can kind of change our energy system very quickly by 2035. And just by this headline, you can kind of get the feel for what's going on. Plummeting solar, wind, and battery costs can accelerate our clean electricity future. So there's nothing in here like, plummeting consumption or, plummeting meat consumption will, change our climate future, things like that. It's kind of, we're going to change the technology on the back end, and then everything on the front end can more or less stay the same. So I would say most kind of contemporary policy proposals tend to be more wizard-like, and wind and solar energy, I would say, are more wizard oriented than profit oriented. Okay, so I have, like last time, I have a discussion published. And so there's no right or wrong answers to these. I just want you to talk about these. So the first one is, which group, wizards or prophets, do you think has been kind of winning the narrative in the, in the larger scale discussion, not necessarily in environmental circles, but in mainstream political circles? Who's been winning the narrative about how to solve environmental problems over the past several decades? The second question is, do we see politicians explicitly running on platforms that seek to restrict humanity's consumption? And the third question is, would you say that your own temperament is more prophet-like or wizard-like, and why?